My name's Jean, and I'm currently the chair of Friends of Windmill Gardens, which is and I'm going to be talking to you today about how we campaigned over a number of years, first to get the Brixton Windmill restored and offered the buildings at risk register where it was languishing in 2002. And in my first report, I'm going to be talking about the first half of what we've achieved as a local residents group. And in the second half, I'm going to talk about how we moved forward to become more sustainable in our project. So it's been an 18-year journey, and we've now achieved the three aims we had when the Friends of Windmill Gardens were set up in 2003 as a local residents group, worried about the state of a grade 2-star listed building that was in our local park. So I need to start by giving a brief history of the windmill itself, because of course it's a bit of a strange situation to have a rural building in the middle of urban London, and pretty overcrowded part of urban London. So this is the windmill today. It's a rural building, as I say, just 3 miles from Trafalgar Square in central London, and it's now owned by the London Borough of Lambeth, our local council, and it stands in a very small park, which they also own, Windmill Gardens. And as I said, we are part of a very diverse community. We're only 3 minutes walk from the very busy and highly polluted A23, the road to Brighton, from central London. And the gardens themselves, which are small, are the local park for at least 7 council housing estates that surround us. And it is an area of high deprivation, and we are working in a borough where 50% of school children do not have English as their first language. So, but of course it wasn't always like this. And so I'm going to take us back 200 years to when the Brixton Hill looked more like this image you see here, which is of a second windmill that existed on Brixton Hill, less than half a mile south of what we now call Brixton Windmill. But I'm showing you this delightful watercolour from 1818, just to give you an indication of what the land was like when our windmill was built 205 years ago. A windy day, indicated, as you can see, by the washing on the line here. So this mill, of course, doesn't exist, and neither do any of the 5 mills that were operating in the Lambeth area when our windmill, which we now call Brixton Windmill, which was then called Ashby's Mill or Lower Mill, Brixton Hill, existed. So we need to talk a bit about how the mill built by John Ashby looked in 1816. The photograph was actually taken when the second generation of Ashbys were operating the windmill. It had sails on it, obviously, because it was powered by wheel. It's a brick tower mill with a cap at the top that rotates. John Ashby had the mill built in 1816. He was a Quaker. He was already established in the milling business, and his extensive family during the 19th century and on into the 20th century operated a number of mills and acted as corn merchants right across the Kent and Surrey area. But the photo I'm showing you, which is the only photo we have of the windmill when it did operate or had recently been operating by wind power, shows the windmill, the mill yard, and on the left there you can see the mill cottage. There was also a very substantial Georgian villa on the site where the mill owners lived, but we've never ever been able to find an image of that. But the problem that faced the Ashby family, who had set up their milling business in Brixton, was that by 1862, the rapid growth of housing along the new railway lines constructed in the 1840s and 1850s to connect London to the south coast threatened the future of flour milling at Brixton. And just to sort of reinforce this point, the map shows, which dates from around about the 1870s, shows that the windmill here, marked in red, in its little area, which is more or less the area of the park that we have now around the windmill. Here is Brixton Hill, and immediately behind the windmill, or to the south of the windmill, the Lambeth Waterworks existed by then. They'd been set up in 1832, and just beyond them, our other near neighbours, Brixton Prison, overlooks the windmill across the covered reservoir. That building had been started in 1819. And to the north of our site were rows and rows of workers' cottages, and all this caused a problem for the windmill. It meant that they were not able to maintain production of flour by wind power. So, but one thing that you can see is the business acumen of the Ashbys in this rather delightful advertising card down here on the left, where they show that they were operating after 1862, when they decided to take a lease out on watermills at Mitcham in order to be able to continue milling flour, that they decided to operate from the two sites, from Mitcham, where they produced the flour, and then from Brixton Hill, where they still had their home. They still had workers living there in the mill cottage, and they could deliver their flour across South London and even further afield. But they also were already establishing the concept of a rural idyll and of a rural industry in the heart of London with this rather beautiful advertising card. So the issue then from Ashby's Mill was that it operated from 1902 to it had been operating from 1862 to 1902 by wind power. And then the lease ran out on the watermills, and they decided to come back to bring flour milling back to Brixton. And they did that by purchasing a more modern, what was at that time in 1902, a very modern piece of equipment, which is a set of stones in a much more compact iron case, cast iron cased, and which was powered by steam, a steam engine, which sat outside the tower. And one of the reasons that the Brixton Tower Mill still exists today is that they decided to put this machine inside the mill, even though the mill was no longer had its sails. They had removed most of the wind-powered machinery in the latter half of the 19th century. They'd sold it on. And the mill was looking from the outside, as shown here in this rather nice 1906 postcard of the site at Brixton Hill. No sails, but a rather strange viewing platform has been constructed around the outside of the windmill. Another thing that was done by the Ashbys, presumably to raise money. They could allow people to climb up inside the mill and view across London and get a fabulous view across London from their viewing platform. But this installation of this modular mill, as I say, driven by steam power, enabled the business to continue right through to 1934. So that at the time was really unusual, to have stone ground flour still being produced in a traditional way with steam-driven stones, and it has enabled us now, when we show the windmill to visitors, the restored windmill to visitors, to explain that what we've got at Brixton are two mills in one. We've got the wind-powered mechanisms, and we've got the Industrial Revolution, which adds to our ability to explain these things to anybody who attends, and particularly to education workshops that we run for local schools. So from 1902 to 34, they still maintained their business. The third generation was getting very old by then. The last miller, Joshua John, the grandson of the original miller, was well into his 70s when he closed the business in 1934. He had never married, but he had a desire for the site to be preserved. He had a vision of that. And he mentioned that to his solicitor, and he wanted it to be a relic of bygone days. So even before he died, a discussion had started about the future of the site, the future of the windmill, and the viability of that being preserved. So the question we had to discuss, and they had to discuss before the Second World War, was, is it worth preserving Brixton Windmill, and is that a viable option? And there was a discussion that took place while Joshua John was still alive with Lambeth Council and the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB, about the potential for preserving the building. And in 1936, after Joshua John had died and left the property, including the windmill, in trust, with this proviso that he really wanted it to be preserved as a relic of bygone days, to quote, the discussion took place about whether that could happen. The local authority were interested, local people were interested. It was the topic of some articles in local newspapers. And in 1936, SPAB did a serious visit to the windmill to see, and the site, to decide whether or not it should be preserved. And they came up with this conclusion. And I'm quoting directly from their report. The whole mill building can be thoroughly cleaned and put in first-rate order for the sum of about £25, which makes my heart turn over. There is a range of outbuildings, they're very extensive. The whole place would make a most excellent unemployment centre or club premises, and I would suggest that this property be preserved. Remember, we're in the middle of the 1930s depression at this time. The mill is of great interest as being almost unique in London, and is quite typical of the traditional practice of windmills built at the time of its erection, 1816. It would be a great pity if such a landmark of old Lambeth was destroyed. So the seas were set for preserving this heritage site. But then, of course, nobody could decide. Even the £25 that was being offered for sale at that time was not forthcoming from the local authority. And then, of course, 1939, World War II broke out, lasted for 6 years. And then there was great pressure after that to use every bit of open space for rehousing those citizens who'd been bombed out of their homes during the war. And there was a threat to the windmill. Someone had proposed to pull it down. Fortunately for us, a group of enlightened local citizens got the building listed with the Ministry of Works, and that meant that it could never be pulled down, or it would be really difficult to pull it down. And in 1951, the windmill was indeed listed, and Lambeth Council agreed that they would buy the mill if they could get financial support from the London Authority, which at that time was the London County Council. Things moved slowly. In the 50s, the council bought the site, and on the proviso that Lambeth laid a park out around it, so it would be a public amenity. And in the 1960s, the outhouses were demolished because by then they were considered dangerous, and work started on making the mill much more safe. And this photograph shows the first iteration of the park, which was about half the size of what it is now, but it is still a very small park. The mill underwent further restoration over several years, paid for by the London Council, which then had become the GLC. It's the machinery the wind-powered machinery which the family had sold on when they decided to take the sails off and no longer use it as a windmill, was replaced with machinery from a similar tower mill in Lincolnshire that was being demolished. And a new set of sails were made, as you can see, to match the only photograph that existed of the windmill in its wind-powered days. In the 1971, the ownership moved to Lambeth Council, but in later years, the windmill did fall into a cycle of neglect, followed by minor and sometimes more extensive repair. But this was in 1968 when this photograph was taken, when the GLC promoted Brixton Windmill as a venue for Londoners to visit at Easter that year when it opened in 1968. And you'll notice here, beside the windmill, there was quite a substantial park-keeper's hut and gardener's hut, and that's where people would go and pay their 1 6d to go inside the windmill to visit it. But after that, I'm afraid, reflecting quite a lot of problems in relation to the way parks were treated and existed and local authority spending cuts and so on, the mill went into a cycle of neglect followed by minor and then sometimes much more major disrepair, and extensive repair works had to be done. And it was a constant source of financial need, which was difficult for the local authority, whether they were willing or unwilling at the time. It seemed to be very difficult for them to maintain it. So by 2002, it was on the buildings at risk register. And here's a photograph of how it was when the Friends were formed in 2003. They were spurred on to create a group which we were encouraged by the council to register as a Friends of the Park group, Friends of Windmill Gardens. That was because there was a structure in Lambeth at the time of getting support and listening to groups that were associated with local parks. And we had three aims in 2003: to restore and reopen the windmill itself, to improve the surrounding park, which was, as you can see already, a pretty much a no-go area at some points, and to develop an education centre building that supported the windmill and could be used by local community groups. So we then, the Friends, who are an entirely volunteer-led group, continued to campaign and raise awareness of the windmill. We had been given, the council had given us a small, had employed directly a group to scope out our first viability plan for the restoration of the windmill. And it was out of that that the first festival that was held in the park pre the formation of the Friends group was organised by this consultancy group called Planet Earth. You'll notice that, and in this festival, local students hoisted a great sunflower made of newspapers up onto the windmill in order to bring it to the attention of the people in the park. But you can see the park was covered with graffiti, the windmill itself was covered with graffiti, and the old park keeper's hut here was completely burnt out by that time. And so it was a pretty difficult situation facing anybody who wanted to enjoy themselves in that park. But we decided that the way forward was to raise awareness. We constantly organised events in the park to engage local residents, to discuss our campaign, to put pressure on Lambeth Council that they should seriously consider the restoration of Brixton Windmill. In 2007, we converted to a charity, and we established a partnership with the council to jointly bid for lottery money as a way forward to pay for the mill's restoration. Our activities were many. We trained guides, even though the windmill could only be opened once a year, and people could only look from inside the ground floor up through the trapdoors to view what was in the windmill, but were not allowed to climb higher because it was considered too dangerous by the council. We had a group of our friends, were actors. Some of our friends were actors, and they put on displays of the history and performances about the history of the windmill. We organised annual summer festivals. We organised football in the park for the children and so on, all sorts of activities to raise awareness. Eventually, the partnership with the council came to fruition in that we put in bids to the Heritage Lottery Fund. We had to put in at least 2 bids, if I remember correctly, because it's a long time ago now. And the second one was successful, but they were joint bids and the money went to the council, but we were consulted at every stage. And I think it would, our support for the windmill and our base in the community, our wide base in the community, I think was very significant in getting that award from the Heritage Lottery Fund of £397, just under £398,000 towards restoring the windmill. And that grant was also meant to fund a 4-year education programme at the windmill, so it paid for a part-time development officer who was in existence up until 2015. The council had to contribute cash as well as an awful lot of officer time to work on the project because they oversaw the restoration process, and they were in charge of the money spent and the commissioning and of contractors and so on. Friends of Windmill Gardens had to raise £2,000 in cash for the project and provide non-cash contributions. In other words, commit to opening the windmill regularly to the public into the future. The council was committed also to maintain the windmill for 10 years, not just for the 5 years of the HLF grant period. And all that was valued at 126,000, nearly 126,500 pounds. But I have to say that the amount of volunteer hours that our organisation has put into these 18 years well exceeds that money total, and has been, I think, very instrumental in making the project both viable and in terms of the restoration successful. So the restoration, there were serious restoration issues to be addressed in 2010 when the money was awarded. It was awarded in the March, and I'm going to go through these very quickly. Pigeon damage, structural damage, the sails had to be taken off. The process of organising the restoration was handed over to a council project officer. Tendering was put out. Architects Danet Johnson, who'd been involved in putting the brief together for the HLF bid, were on board for managing the project. They were specialists in historic restoration projects. The main contractor was Stone West, who had a very high reputation, had been worked on St Pancras Station and the St Paul's. But one of the problems we faced all the way through this project was that although the Friends were involved in the steering group and so on, we were not the runners of the project, and things went quite slowly. I think that's because it was a local authority. It was only one of many things they had to consider. The contractual and tendering processes for local authorities are quite complex. And also during the process, there often are officer changes, which never helps, especially on long-term projects. But the end result was that the actual restoration work took place at the wrong time of the year over the winter months, which made it all very, very difficult. But as I say, Stone West were the main contractors, and Owlsworth IJP, specialists in mill work, were the subcontractors who did all the work on the building itself and the mill machinery. And before that, of course, the Friends had formed quite close relationships we were members of the Spab Mill section. We formed close relationships with the Mills Archive Trust. We sought advice from millers and mill owners around the country, and they had come and helped us train our guides and so on in the preparatory period. All the internal brickwork had to be checked and repaired. A lot of woodwork inside had to be repaired. But by the end, the mill looked fabulous. And this was it getting ready for this is the stone floor inside the windmill in 2011, ready to meet the first visitors, which we had planned to open we'd been told the windmill would be complete and able to be open to the public in May. And we had planned a great celebration of that fact, publicising that all the time within our local community. And on May Day, the first May bank holiday in 2011, we opened the windmill to great public acclaim. We thought we would have a gentle parade up the hill from the centre of Brixton to the windmill, just to publicise the fact that the windmill was open. But when we turned up in Windrush Square opposite Lambeth Town Hall, it looked as though nobody was going to be there. And we were all a bit nervous about it. But in the end, 2,000 people joined the celebration parade up the hill, to the consternation of the local police, because this is an A route. And we managed to walk up the hill. People came from all our diverse community they were really interested in this development. The local mayor was with us, obviously, our local MP at the time. This was our first education officer, a development and education, part-time development and education officer, paid for out of the HLF fund. And this gentleman here was a direct descendant from the Ashby family, because part of the process was constant publicity. And when they heard that this windmill was going to be restored, they got in touch with us and sent us lots of information about the history of the family. So Henry Ashby, as he was known, Anthony Henry Ashby, was John Ashby, the first miller's great-great-great-great-grandson, and he cut the ribbon for us on May the 2nd, 2011. So what were the lessons learned from this project? Well, yes, definitely have a clear a vision and stick to it. And you have to stick to it very hard, particularly, I think, if you're working with another partner organisation who really can make them decisions and is the owner of the building, which was the situation we were in. We worked with our local authority. We had to be prepared for changes in political policy. We had to be overcome profound financial problems that faced the council. After all, in the middle of the process, we had the 2008 crash that resulted in serious council spending cuts and delays. That threatened the promise, the funding for some, and how it was being spent, and the fact that, for example, this building beside the windmill, which was a 1 o'clock club, was closed just at the point when we opened. And that created all sorts of conflicts in the local community, who said, why does the council put money into a building and not into childcare, for example? And we had to work hard to keep that relationship with our local community and explain the process to them. So you have to keep your vision at the heart of your partnership project, make your voice heard as strongly as possible. But of course, we're not the experts, we're only the volunteers. And that is something that if you can bring on experts into your own organisation as volunteers, it's great, because then you can argue the case. Because otherwise you always have to bow to the people who say they have the superior knowledge, and who often do obviously have the superior knowledge, but do they always make the right decisions? You need to always keep your project in the mind of your supporters, continually build and widen your support base. And the Friends of Windmill Gardens are particularly good at that. We have a very strong social media presence, and even before social media was invented, we made sure we got on the local radio, we made sure we were in the local press about our project. So that's how we did it. We were convinced it was a viable project. We worked with the council to get them the funding for it. And we also raised our voice to ensure that our long-term aim was that this building should not re-enter a cycle of decline and disarray and need more repair. There are lessons to be learned maybe about the process of the actual restoration. We question whether it was a good decision to recover the building with pitch, but of course, planning, English heritage, all those people said that's how it had to be done, because that's how it had always traditionally been done. Although we know now, 12 years on from that restoration, that covering the mill with pitch and repitching it every so often actually traps water inside rather than resolving the problem of damp, which is an ongoing problem. And we face now another quite serious decision about how to secure the structure again. After all, it was built in 205 years old of London stock brick that weren't meant to last forever, and it doesn't have any foundations, and it's just a round building built on London clay, and it's amazing that it stood this long. So that's our first achievement, and in the second half I will talk about how we try and make sure the project is completely sustainable. So any questions? I'm going to talk about a second journey that our organisation took, which was after the 4 years of the restoration project. The Friends Windmill Gardens, when the Friends Windmill Gardens opened the windmill for free public tours at least 2 afternoons a month every year from Easter to October, we also were supporting the work of our Development and Education Officer. And his primary role, well, we had 2 officers, one didn't stay very long, she moved on to another more a different project. But the second Development and Education Officer was a really creative young man and full of great ideas. And he developed a very good relationship with local primary schools to deliver the education workshops, which had been a primary outcome of the restoration of the windmill itself. And but the problem he had right from the start was that there was no base by the windmill that belonged to the windmill. We had to share what had been a 1 o'clock club and was now later run as a stay and play building for preschool children. And that meant it was a very crowded space if you were bringing a class of 30 even primary school children in to look at the windmill and work, because the windmill itself, of course, is also quite a small structure. But he was very innovative. He worked out all sorts of great creative ideas with the children. And he also developed some new projects for our annual program of community activities, which was also an expected outcome of the original HLF restoration grant. So this slide just shows some of those things. The Friends were constantly training more guides to be tour guides for the new, because we opened the windmill so regularly, and they had to be trained not only in the history of the windmill, the mechanics of the windmill, but also in health and safety and issues like that. We developed a program that went right through the summer period, from Easter through to Christmas. And you can see examples of some of those events here. To fundraise those activities, we raised, and the Friends continued to raise lots of smaller grants to fund the activities. And we also encourage donations, but all our events in the park are free for access. And because we know there are many families who can't afford to pay fees or make donations. Over the years, immediately while the Development and Education Officer was still in post, some really good projects were developed. In 2013, an MA student at Central St Martin's came to us with this proposal for a community project to paint a very large mural about the history of the Ashby family in the park. And we obviously accepted that. She worked with the Development Education Officer with the cluster of schools around the windmill, which call themselves the Windmill Cluster, by the way. And children were engaged in that. And also they engaged with people living in the local care home as well. And that also coincided with a grant that the Friends got from the Lottery Fund, which was from the All Our Stories project that they had at the time, which enabled us to collect oral histories of people who'd lived in the area, who knew the windmill in different ways. They'd grown up beside it. They knew it before the houses the Victorian cottages that they had grown up in were pulled down and demolished and replaced by a 1970s council estate. We had all these different generations. And in 2014, we were able to publish a book, Mill Memories, which was a collection of these oral histories, and which also gathered information from the descendants of the Ashby family and local people and parks workers who'd worked in the park and wondered about the windmill all their lives, and even prison officers who used to take, when they were on suicide watch inside the prison, would take people to look, inmates to look at the windmill across the covered reservoir and see it and try to convince them that life was still worth living. So it's a really good book that came out of that project. And we also toured the libraries of Lambeth with an interactive exhibition, which also kept the idea of the windmill in everybody's mind during this period. But we knew that in 2015, a Heritage Lottery grant would end. We'd no longer have a Development and Education Officer. We wanted to continue the education program. We needed a building of our own because we only had access to the Stay and Play building one day a week and sometimes at weekends. So we started a campaign to revive a promise that had been made by Lambeth Council in the capital programme for parks, that they would develop an education centre or a windmill support building in the park for the community. That was there down in paper as part of a 5-year plan, but nothing was happening. So we needed to convince the council that we needed this building and to do research into it. The Friends themselves did a lot of research into what kind of buildings could possibly be put in the park and what their costs were. But in the end, Lambeth Council agreed in principle in 2016 that they would provide a building, and they commissioned Clearview Consulting to produce a feasibility study, a 10-year business study plan of how this building could be sustainable and how it in turn would sustain the historic windmill itself and potentially maybe also help with the improvement of the park. We engaged very closely with the consultants to develop that 10-year plan. And in October 2016, the council actually approved expenditure of £360,000 for the construction of a windmill centre. Brixton Windmill also happened to be celebrating its 200th anniversary in 2016, which we made a great programme throughout the year, starting with treasure hunts and going on to have a beer and bread festival for the very first time, where we are associated with local micro breweries. That's gone on to be an annual event until COVID hit, and been very, very popular. We had started to train our millers in milling flour using the modular mill, which now had the electric motor on it. We realized we could produce a very high quality stone ground wholemeal flour, so that was fed into our business plan. On May the 2nd at the Beer and Bread Festival, we actually launched that branded flour. During the 2016, a local design company, Ili Kishimoto, who had an international reputation and had their studios just behind the windmill and could see the windmill every day when they worked in their design studio, the Mark Ili of Ili Kishimoto agreed to become our cultural ambassador during 2016. And at his own expense, he made a set of very modern sails for the windmill, which on the Mills weekend, which is in May, the weekend following or 2 weeks after the Beer and Bread Festival, he got these at his own expense, or he persuaded a company he knew to provide a cherry picker so that these sails could be put up. And the millwright came, who had done the restoration work and was commissioned to do the regular maintenance visits by the council. He came that Saturday, and we got the sails turning to everybody's delight. We also have been developing merchandise sales to help fund our work and promote the windmill. And everywhere we were considering how we could improve our presence and convince the council that we really needed this building. Just going back, Ili Kishimoto, or Mark Ili, introduced us to a new architectural practice that was moving their headquarters from King's Cross into, well, they're not a new practice, but who was newly being introduced into Brixton, because they moved their headquarters from King's Cross to Brixton. And this firm, Squire and Partners, were very keen to engage with the local community. They also had a history themselves of building community buildings all around the world. And they were also very interested in building wood-framed buildings. And they agreed to do design work pro bono for a building to sit beside the windmill and be the education stroke visitor stroke community centre that was in our vision. And they worked very closely with us on that. And they discussed with us all the things that we had put into the 10-year business case for the building when we went when it was presented to the council to convince them to find the money to produce this building. All the different funding streams that we anticipated, or income streams that we anticipated we could get, to utilise the fact that our unique selling point was that we were the only working windmill in central London that was still producing flour, to ensure that our building had a good kitchen in it that could be used for baking classes. So Squire and Partners agreed to do the design for the building pro bono, and Lambeth Council accepted that offer. And they discussed with us and looked at the history of the windmill itself, and they realised that the purpose of this new building would be to create a self-sustainable life cycle for the windmill and for the friends and for the local community. And these were some of their initial sketches. What was important to them was that long-term, the building could support sustainable functions, self-sustainable functions. And that was exactly what we needed. And they came up with a fantastic design. They also had to, of course, take on the problems of a new building that was going to be built in a park. Remember, there always had been a building in the park, which, if you think back to my previous presentation, you could see had been burnt, had the roof been burnt out, and eventually in 2008, I think it was actually had to be taken down because it was a dangerous structure. Now, some officers in the council didn't have as long memories as we had, but we had to convince them that there had always been buildings around the windmill, and that even though we all wanted to have as much green space as possible, it would be able, Squire and Partners design would be able to be unobtrusive and would not much increase the footprint of the building that had sat there since 1968. And certainly it would replicate the buildings that had clustered around the windmill, as you can see in this photograph here, and in the drawings of the mill yard in the 19th century when and in the early 20th century when the windmill was in operation. So that is the footprint of those buildings that were the original buildings associated with the mill. This is the footprint of the building that Squire and Partners were proposing to build for us, right up against the boundary wall which separates Windmill Gardens from Thames Water. We had explored all sorts of other options prior to Squire and Partners being taken on board to design the building, one of which had been, before 9/11, to maybe use jointly some buildings that were not being used by Thames Water, some really rather beautiful Victorian buildings they have on their site. But following 9/11, the Thames Water site became an absolutely fortressed area, and nobody was able to go on the site unless they were working there. The council themselves were keen that the stay and play building could be utilised, and they asked Squire and Partners to look at that, the feasibility of maybe joining the two buildings together or sharing a building. The Friends knew from the start that that was not possible. You couldn't possibly have a community building that was shared with preschool children facilities because of the safeguarding issues. And eventually the council were convinced that what we needed was our own independent building. And Squire and Partners came up with this absolutely lovely design. This is a mock-up that they created for the planners of this long, low black building, black cladded building here that could be locked up at night and could be opened out into the park during the days. And we were really delighted with this design. But the process of building was slow. The council did appoint a contractor. They started the tendering process in November 2017, but it didn't actually, they appointed someone in January 2018, but the work was due to start in March, but that didn't happen. Eventually, the work only started in November, although the first completion date had supposed to be been December 2018, which threw all our plans out of kilter. Our fundraising that was going on in the background to prepare to be able to take over this building and manage it properly. Our first employment of a staff member to help us train ourselves up to become a much more sustainable group and a group capable of managing a new building. There were very frustrating construction delays. The site was only set up in December 2018. Then the site closed down for Christmas. And the Friends had to negotiate the route through the site because it was much bigger than had been agreed, and now enclosed the windmill itself. But we did manage to deliver our Christmas event at the windmill in that period of time. But it was August 2019 before the Douglas fir framed building actually had a roof and the floor had been laid and the end walls were complete and interior work could start. So that was very, very frustrating. In preparation for managing and taking on a lease, the Friends had to make a lot of changes. Changes that Alex has pointed out will often have to be made. We needed to relook at our charitable status. We were an unincorporated charity, so we decided to become a charitable incorporated organisation so that we could sign a lease with the council, could manage a building, could employ staff. Our sub-raising group, we became the CIO in February 2018. We organise the Friends. I haven't mentioned this before, but we organise the Friends, which is a membership organisation, and we're a CIO that is managed by the trustees, but who are responsible to their members. So we report annually, and more frequently, we have an annual general meeting. We more frequently hold general meetings to engage with our members so that they can help influence our policy. And one of the ways we engage our volunteers is that we have subgroups. We have a communication subgroup, which is really good at promoting the windmill and running all our social media and running websites. We have an event subgroup. We have a park subgroup that looks after the park. We have, and most importantly, we have a fundraising subgroup who have had to work really, really hard all through. They managed to achieve, get an 18-month resilient Heritage Lottery Resilient Fund grant, which meant that we could develop the skills required to manage the new building and employ our first part-time member of staff. It also paid for more volunteers to be trained in food hygiene, first aid, basic health and safety, and all these things. We also, in that period, did some leadership training for our trustees. Because already we knew that the chair, i.e. me, who'd been the chair for a very long time, was going to step down once the new building was established. But of course, that process has taken much longer, and I will be standing down next October. But that succession, as Alex said, is really, really important, succession planning. The fundraising group got a second grant, a very substantial 2-year award from Power to Change, which helped us employ 2 part-time members of staff. Power to Change grant paying 75% of their salary. It also paid for a total redesign of our website, a new website that is much more interactive, includes an online shop, as well as integrating volunteer applications, membership applications, booking systems, and so on. And the Power to Change also helps with extra training and with furnishing the new building and paying for further work to improve the environment of Windmill Gardens. We also got a £10,000 grant from WREF to do the restoration of the park after the building site was removed, because we knew that whole area of the park would have been pretty much trashed by the long period of time when it was a building site. With the Power to Change grant, we had to have signed a lease. But the delay on signing the lease was because of the delay with the building. In the end, the council had to agree with us an agreement to lease, and that was enough to be able to convince Power to Change to release the money for the grant that they'd awarded us, which was a very substantial grant of, let me just give you the amount. We got the £41,000 from the Heritage Lottery grant that I mentioned for upskilling us, and then overnight nearly 96,000 from Power to Change for 2 years to support us setting ourselves up as a business, basically, and managing the new building. One of the big struggles we had was to convince the council to give us a lease that was longer than 3 years. Because no, as Alex has pointed out, no major funder will even look at you unless you've got a lease on a building of at least 25 years. In the end, because they weren't paying for the building, we for any construction money, we persuaded Power to Change to let us have the grant with only a 20-year lease, and that's what we signed with the council. The council said that if we went over 20 years, it would be an asset change, and we didn't want to take the asset on. We wanted Lambeth to remain the freeholders and our landlords in that sense. We had a long struggle negotiating the lease itself, and because one of the issues we found with our particular local authority, and maybe it's not the case with every local authority, but I think it is built into the very stringent processes they have to go through because they're handling public money, is that often one part of the council doesn't know what the other part of the council is doing. And that is quite difficult. We negotiated for years what we thought would be in this in our lease. But when we actually received the lease from the legal department, we had to restart the negotiations again, which was very time consuming and also quite expensive to us, because of course we had to have our own solicitors on board for that process. Anyhow, One of the other things we had to do, we always knew, was that despite the fact that the building was coming with a lot of very good storage space, these amazing cupboards that can be moved around, storage cupboards all down the side of the new building that can be moved around and allow you to divide the room up and so on. It also came with loft space above the baking kitchen, which is at that end, and the storeroom, which is behind that. We did need to raise the money for the chairs and tables and all the obvious things that you need in a new building. We set ourselves a target of £49,000. We had secured almost 20,000 already from grants. In June 2018, we launched a 4-week crowdfunder appeal to raise 12,000, and our communication subgroup worked really hard on that. And in the end, we raised £17,000 once we got the gift aid element into the grant. And that came from our community. And that was a way of keeping the project alive in the community. And so we had the total in hand to furnish the building and to do the landscaping work outside before we actually signed the lease and moved in. It was 2020 before we could finally move in. We had been promised that the building would be completed by March the 31st, 2020, and we were working towards that. Our staff that had been employed already for some months were having to work from begged and borrowed sites. We paid the local, we were able to rent desk space in the local housing office for the estate that borders our park. The other member of staff was working from the Parks Department office over in Brockwell Park, which was, you know, almost a mile away. So it wasn't perfect, but we thought everything would be all right in March when we could all move into our building. But of course, 16th of March, the government, announced the lockdown, and that was yet another delay. The site went into lockdown immediately, even though we were so tantalizingly close to actually completing the building, and our staff had to work from home, and we were unable to start delivering our business plan that we'd worked so hard on. And we were so, we had envisaged how we were going to bring the income in for this building, and how we were going to move from being dependent on grants to being much more able to sustain ourselves through trading. And all that was just had a coach and horses driven right through it. And so we eventually were only able to sign the lease on the 1st of July. The council immediately gave us the keys. I think they just wanted us in and out of their hair. And we moved all our stuff in. We'd had our accumulated resources and assets were spread across 2 garages, 1 pram shed, several people's lofts and cellars all around the borough, and we had to bring them all into the windmill, into the new centre. And of course we had to sanitise everything before it went into the centre. But we had a great team of volunteers who helped us do that on one of the nicer warm days in the summer of 2020. And then we were not able to do very much with the building. But we're extremely pleased with it. It's a beautiful building, as you could see from the slides I showed you. It opens out onto the park. It has bifold doors all down one side, so you can almost be part of the park if you want to, or you can shutter it all up for security reasons at the end of the night. Planning eventually gave us the permission, obviously, when Squire and Partners made their application. We had to go back to them to just explain that we weren't just going to be an education centre, we were going to be a community centre as well, and we were going to hire the space out, but they agreed to that change. We have permission to use the building from 7 in the morning till 10 at night, provided we don't disturb the neighbours or impact too negatively on the park. So it's a great space. And the few things that we have been able to do through the pandemic, our millers have milled all the way through. And that has been a great asset for us. We delivered flour to local shops, but we also from the start decided we would deliver to food banks, and we mill and take fresh flour to food banks every week. Also our gardeners produce vegetables in the summer months and add them to the donations to the food bank. We raised money from special COVID based type grants that asked you to deliver your your aims and outcomes differently. And we've developed education packs, resource packs that also went out through the food banks and through local schools for children who are in digital poverty. In the winter, we managed in a little area, the council finally agreed that we could do an activity in the park so long as we were socially distanced, and we delivered a winter market, and the children were able to come to the door of the windmill and see Santa in his socially distanced grotto. And that was a really popular thing. People queued all the way down the road to almost as far as the A23, waiting for their turn to come into the park, because of course we had to restrict the numbers, and it was raining all day long, but it happened, and it gave us a flavour of what we knew we would be able to do once lockdown was over. We briefly reopened for guided tours in September, but then we were locked down again. And we have only just now started to come out of that situation. So what are the lessons we've learned from the past 18 years? Well, we stuck to our aims and we've delivered them. And that couldn't have been done without the very wide community support we have from the local community, but also from our members. Some of us have been there since the beginning and are still working and giving leadership on the in our trustee board. Signing the 20-year lease to manage the Brixton Windmill Centre and deliver the community service agreement that went with it. When we actually signed the lease, there were 5 documents. There was the lease itself, there was the community service agreement, there was the letter to waive the rent if we delivered the community service agreement, and there was a letter, there was an agreement to allow us to access the windmill. And we had to have a struggle to make sure that when we were in the windmill, we were allowed to produce flour for sale as well, and not just for education purposes. We managed to sign all those, but that was a big step for us. It's a big responsibility for volunteer trustees to, take on the responsibility of a building for 20 years, of making it sustainable, and of, above all, being responsible for your staff and making sure that you can continue to pay them. COVID-19 has forced us to review our original business plan. As I say, our intention to decrease dependency on grants and increase income from trading has taken a big knock. It's going to take us longer to achieve that goal, and we are currently exploring new sources of trading income, and we'll have to revise our plans. We've brought new people onto our trustee board, our young lead miller, who's been really good at promoting the milling and is much sought after by the media, has stuck with it all the way and has now become a trustee. We advertised for trustee. We did a skills audit and advertised for trustees that would have the skills that we didn't have within our body at that time. And we brought on 3 new trustees this year who are really making a change on our board and making us much more strategic and looking very clearly to the future. We've gone through a whole process of what are our priorities, and we survived the 18 months building delay and the months and months of lockdown, and we're finally starting to generate income from the building through hiring fees and sources other than flower sales. We've got a pop-up cafe which we've been running whenever we've been allowed to under social distancing regulations, and the takings there are improving with the weather, and it's changed the atmosphere in the park. So the photograph you see here is of our first open day this year, and it was a successful event, even though social distancing meant we could only take our visitors up to the 2nd floor of the windmill. But we opened the windmill cafe, we opened the windmill shop, and we are able to sell regularly from our building, as well as having, when we did the £20,000 of the Power to Change grant, enabled us to reorganize our website, and we do have an online shop facility there now. So we plan to continue with our main aims, which is to develop the building as a real community hub that can help sustain financially the future of the Brixton Windmill itself. And we are developing the area around the windmill to be a proper heritage site, almost. We're even growing heritage wheat in the new terrace garden that we built as a result of our landscaping work with the grant from WREF. So that's where we're at. That's our past I suppose almost instinctively and sort of organically, we actually tick quite a lot of the boxes that Alex said had to be ticked for a sustainable, a viable, and then a sustainable project. But it is a struggle. And of course, the major problem is funding and where your income is going to come from, and whether or not we long term we can really become totally sustainable without grants, because education being one of our main purposes does not actually generate a lot of income. You cover your costs, but what could generate income, and what we're hoping to be able to do, is in our beautiful baking kitchen, attract people who can come and do a milling baking day. Nobody else in London can offer that. And we hope to be able to sell that to businesses who might want to encourage their workers to work together rather than always working from home in the future. So that's us, and that's what we've achieved, and that's our contribution to this discussion. So any questions?
Thank you.